which I'm a big fan of, is this stuff. And this is called Scotch Brite, that's the trade name. And it was invented by 3M, I think, or they certainly produced the best one of these. And this is an abrasive pad. It looks like a pan scourer, but it isn't. It's like a kind of pan scourer with knobs on. This is a medium grade one. They come in a sheet like this size, I think, usually. I cut a little end off here. They're about $5 a sheet. You can get them for less if you hang around. Don't buy the knockoff ones. Buy the real 3M ones. They last better. So this stuff is like a sandpaper, but it's fully flexible. So if you're going to be keying, now when you'll hear painters sometimes, and I talk about it when I'm talking about hydro dip, they say about scotching the surface of the plastic. This is what they mean. It's using a Scotch Brite pad. Now the beauty of Scotch Brite is that it comes in some ridiculously fine grades, and you can use it for things that you can't use paper for. And it gets into places like these little ridges in the shell. So if we were going to prepare this shell for paint and we were just going to go and spray some primer on it as it is, I would probably use this. I would probably scotch it first, because you can get into the corners. And again, if I just use the corner of this, normally I cut it up into a smaller piece, but if I just use a little bit of this, I can actually go around the digicam. I'm just being really quick to show you what it will do. So with the Scotch pad, what that's done is that has now taken the shine off this surface, and it's got right down into this groove here and right the way along here, and that's just taken the shine off. And this is less caustic than like a paper, and you can see that it's left the digicam intact, but it has given that a key, so ready for paint. And the other one that you can use this for, this comes in several different grades. Ultra fine is the finest grade of this, and if you've sprayed clear lacquer and you've left that clear lacquer for more than 24 hours and you want to coat again, you can't coat on top of old lacquer, because once it's gone hard, it's a gloss surface and you won't get good adhesion. So ultra fine is about the only thing that you can use on lacquer. Or if you've made a mistake on lacquer and you need to maybe key it up and do it again, like it's gone hazy, you know, it's a little dry, you need to key it up again. Ultra fine Scotch is the only thing that you can use on that. Also, you can remove failed hydro dip with Scotch pad. Again, the ultra fine is good for that. You can literally remove it, dry the shell, and then you can have a go at dipping again without redoing the base. So they're very well worth having. I think they're one of my favourite abrasives, the Scotch Brite pad. So that covers how we would key. And if we were doing the entire shell, we would obviously have keyed the whole shell. And one of the things that you might have found when you do your guide coats, say your filler, you've done your filler and you discover that there's some little tiny gaps which you couldn't get into with sandpaper, you may find that they need some further sanding. And also when you're prepping filler, you may find there's lumps in the corners. That's where these come in. These are sanding sticks. The one on the left is a nail file that I bought in a dime store or pound shop in the UK. And this one I think is a dedicated sanding stick. They come in loads of different shapes. You can even get them in angles, triangles, squares, flats. If you want to make your own, you can get lollipop sticks. If you're in America, you can have a popsicle stick. And then you can stick this stuff to it with contact adhesive so that you can create your own ones relatively cheap, cut around the edge with a sharp blade, and you can have two sides. Now the beauty of these is that you can get in, again, they keep a nice flat edge. And on somewhere like here where you might not be able to get the block in, but you want to sand this so that these two surfaces where the join is blend completely flat. This will let you do that because it will get in there along the edge in an even way, and it'll allow you to do this where you can just sand that edge area, look, which you just can't do with other things. And the nail files are slightly less effective because they're not really that strong. They do work, but they're not as good. Some nail files are better than others. If you can find black nail files, they're generally quite good because they've got a similar stuff onto this. But this one I've had for ages, and I think I bought these for doing those first couple of flat tops. And you can see that's still working even after all that time. So those are useful. And again, you can get those from model stores, you can get them online. If you look up sanding sticks, you'll find an awful lot of those different ones. So that's sanding sticks for corners and small work. And now you'd be thinking about priming, and you get your primer on, and you may have to do several different runs of priming and guide coating. And guide coating is where we spray a light black coat over, and then we use a fine paper, so probably a 400 or a 600, maybe even an 800 like this one. And see, this is an 800, and what you would do is you'd go over the whole surface, and the 800 would show you anywhere that was black is where you had a low spot, and you might want to go over it again, and that's particularly good when you filled in a void like this. Sometimes you'll get high and low spots on the edges, and they can be really hard to see. I did a couple of spray jobs for Newton Nerf recently, and some of those, and he'd obviously done quite a lot of guide coating because his was pretty flat, but sometimes you get little tiny lines around the edges and you can't see them until it's too late. So guide coating is worth doing. After guide coating, you then want the primer, build the primer right up and get your good 4 coats of primer on. You then might want to key it again before you put your base on, and that's where either of these two would come in good. Again, scotching, very useful. The thing you have to be careful with at the primer stage is that when on sharp edges, you don't cut through the sharp edges. So that would be a fine, not an ultra fine, possibly an ultra fine. Too fine and you will ruin the adhesive surface of the primer. Generally, if you sprayed your primer right and you've done your prep work, I like to leave the surface of the primer alone, because then it's all bumpy and I know I'm going to put my base on. If you've used a primer base, like Army Painter, that's a coloured primer base, or you're going to dip, obviously you're going to leave the surface alone if you're going to dip. You're just going to spray your base, dip, and then you'll do your final clear over the top. But if you've used a coloured primer and you think it needs a little bit of, you've got to run or whatever, and that's where this comes in handy. 800 with a block on runs is really useful. And then if you just want to key it up, a little bit of 800 or a 600 over the surface, and then clean it. So that brings us to cleaning. What I usually do is that when I've finished all my filler work, I'll guide coat and I'll sand and I'll do it again, and then you'll see all this dust. When I'm ready, the shell's apart, I'll then wash the shell. I'll use warm water. I might use a tiny bit of soap. Some people like to use soap, some people don't. You have to be careful of silicates in your soap. Generally speaking, a really good wash with a light sponge and a clean, and then dry before painting, to make sure that any residue from your fingers, if you've got silicone, is present in lots of our stuff. And I generally scrub the shells with like just a scrubbing brush and a bit of dishwashing detergent before I start work, to remove the silicone, so that I'm not tracking silicone grease from inside the blaster all over my shell, because paint hates silicone. So there's the abrasives that I use for Nerf, and the next video I'm going to try and do for you guys is top 5 tips to make your mods more professional. So I'm going to reveal a couple of the things that I do to make mods really different from just being a kind of a regular mod to being something that you can be really proud of. So I'm going to share my best top 5 tips for how to mod better.